Alex pushed open the diner's creaky door, his worn boots brushing against the linoleum floor. Inside, the greasy scent of frying bacon and stale coffee filled the air. The Route 66 diner buzzed with the muffled chatter of locals, their heads turning in unison as he entered. Alex, a quiet man in his late 30s, had an unassuming air, his sunburned face and weathered leather jacket a testament to years on the road. At a corner table sat a group of bikers, their leather vests adorned with patches that marked them as members of a local gang. They were rowdy, their laughter coarse, echoing through the small space. One of them, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, was the first to notice Alex. His sneer was instantaneous. "Well, look at this," the man called out, his voice cutting through the diner's hum. "Who let the drifter in?" Alex didn't respond. He kept his gaze low, walking toward a booth near the window. The waitress, a thin woman with tired eyes, hesitated for a moment before approaching him. Before she could ask for his order, the scarred biker stood, clapping his meaty hands together. "Hey buddy, I'm talking to you." His companions chuckled, their voices laced with derision. Alex, still silent, picked up the laminated menu and began scanning it. This seemed to further incense the biker. "What's the matter? Can't hear? Or are you too good for us?" The other bikers joined in, taunting him with whistles and laughter. Alex's hands tightened around the edges of the menu, but he kept his composure. The waitress looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot. "Let me know when you're ready to order," she murmured before retreating. "Maybe he doesn't speak English," another biker said mockingly, slapping the table. "What are you, some kind of immigrant? This ain't your country, pal." Scarred face moved closer, looming over Alex's booth. "You deaf and dumb? We don't like strangers who think they can just waltz in here without respect." Still, Alex didn't respond. His silence seemed to fuel their irritation. "Check this out," Scarred face said, pulling a chair from another table and planting it backward in front of Alex. He leaned in close. "You ignoring me, boy?" One of the bikers made a comment under his breath, too low for most to hear, but the laughter that followed was loud and sharp. A flash of anger crossed Alex's face, but it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. The diner's atmosphere had turned tense, the other patrons sitting rigidly, avoiding eye contact with the scene unfolding. Scarred face slapped the table hard, causing the coffee cups to rattle. "I'm talking to you," he barked. "What's your name, stranger? Or don't you got one?" Alex finally looked up, his calm gaze meeting the bikers. "Alex," he said simply. Scarred face grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Alex, huh? What brings you to our fine town?" Alex didn't answer right away. "Just passing through," he said eventually, his voice measured. The biker gang erupted in laughter. "Passing through," mimicked one of them in a mocking tone. "That's rich. We don't take kindly to passers-through who don't show respect." "What do you want?" Alex asked, his voice steady but low. Scarred face's grin widened. "What do we want?" He looked back at his crew. "Oh, I don't know, boys. What do we want?" "Maybe he could buy us a round of coffee," one of them suggested, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Or maybe," another chimed in, "he could clean our boots with that fancy jacket of his." The tension in the diner was palpable. The waitress stood behind the counter, her fingers gripping the edge nervously. Alex's jaw tightened, but he remained seated, his eyes never leaving Scarred face. "Or maybe," Scarred face said, his voice dropping into a threatening whisper, "you can get on your knees and apologize for walking in here like you own the place." Alex's hand twitched, the muscles in his arm flexing slightly. He let out a slow, controlled breath. "Come on, Alex," Scarred face taunted, leaning even closer. "What's it gonna be?" In that moment, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Alex's eyes flickered toward the waitress, then back to Scarred face. "I don't want trouble," he said quietly. Scarred face laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Oh, you don't want trouble? Too late for that." Another biker, a wiry man with a long beard, reached over and grabbed Alex's coffee cup, tipping it over so the dark liquid spilled onto the table. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Guess you'll have to clean that up." Alex stood slowly, towering over the seated Scarred face. The diner seemed to shrink around them as their eyes locked. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. "I'll leave," Alex said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "You won't see me again." Scarred Face smirked. "Oh no, you're not leaving yet. Not until you show us some respect." It was then that Alex's demeanor shifted slightly, a subtle but chilling transformation. His expression hardened, his gaze sharpening like a blade. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed Scarred Face's features. The bikers' jeers grew louder, feeding off each other's bravado as they circled Alex like wolves scenting prey. Scarred Face leaned back in his chair, grinning smugly at the rising tension. "What's the matter, Alex?" he taunted. "You too good to play along? Or are you just scared?" Alex stayed quiet, his face unreadable, his eyes locked on the worn linoleum floor. His restraint only seemed to embolden them. "Maybe he doesn't understand English," sneered one of the bikers, a wiry man with greasy hair. "Where you from, Alex? You one of them illegals? Think you can just walk into our country and take over?" The laughter that followed was harsh and biting, the kind that made the few remaining patrons glance nervously at the door, contemplating escape. A tall, lanky biker named Mike, whose vest bore a crude Confederate flag patch, stood up. "Maybe we ought to teach him some manners," he said, smirking. He swaggered over to Alex's booth, his boots scuffing loudly against the floor. He leaned down, his face inches from Alex's. "Hey, buddy," Mike drawled, his voice thick with mockery. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" He reached out, his fingers hovering just above Alex's shoulder. "Or maybe you're just too soft to handle a little friendly touch?" The moment Mike's hand brushed his jacket, Alex's head snapped up, his gaze piercing. His jaw was tight, and a flicker of something dangerous passed through his eyes. The room seemed to shift as his silence took on a different weight. Less submission, more calculation. Mike hesitated, his smirk faltering for a split second before he quickly covered it with a laugh. "What's that look for, huh? You gonna do something?" He pushed Alex's shoulder lightly, testing him. "Come on, tough guy. Show us what you've got." Scarred Face stood up, slapping his hands together loudly. "Come on, Alex. Don't be shy. Show us what kind of man you are. Or maybe," he paused, grinning maliciously, "maybe you're not much of a man at all." The bikers erupted into laughter again, the sound coarse and grating. Alex didn't move, his stillness unnerving in the face of their growing aggression. He finally looked at Mike, his voice steady but cold. "You don't want to do this." "Oh, he talks now," Mike said, throwing up his hands dramatically. "Guess we struck a nerve." He glanced back at Scarred Face and the others. "What do you think, boys? Should I back off, or should we see what he's really made of?" The diner's air was thick with tension, the smell of burnt coffee and frying grease mingling with the acrid tang of aggression. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter, her hand hovering over the phone, unsure whether to call for help or hope the situation fizzled out on its own. "You don't belong here," Mike said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour against Alex's face. "Guys like you think you can just walk into our town, into our country, and take whatever you want." "Yeah," chimed in another biker. "You probably don't even have a green card, do you? Think you're better than us just because you're quiet?" Mike smirked, emboldened by the chorus of agreement. "Bet you've never worked an honest day in your life. Living off handouts, eh? Say something." Scarred Face barked, slamming his fist on the table. "Or are you just gonna sit there like the coward you are?" The humiliation was palpable, the bikers' laughter echoing off the walls of the tiny diner. But Alex remained still, his expression unreadable. "You think you're tough?" Mike taunted, jabbing a finger into Alex's chest. "You're nothing, you hear me? Just a piece of dirt under my boot." Scarred Face approached, his grin widening as he saw Mike's provocations go unanswered. "Maybe we should see what he's hiding under that jacket. Bet he's got something to be ashamed of." Mike reached out again, grabbing the collar of Alex's jacket, but this time Alex's hand shot up, gripping Mike's wrist with a strength that made the biker wince. For a moment, the room went silent, the bikers staring in disbelief. "Let go," Alex said quietly, his voice calm but laced with steel. Mike tried to yank his hand back, But Alex's grip was unyielding. "Hey man," Mike stammered, his bravado slipping. "Take it easy." Alex released him, his eyes never leaving Mike's. The biker stumbled back, clutching his wrist and glaring at Alex. "You think you're tough now, huh? You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Scarred Face stepped in, placing a hand on Mike's shoulder. "Calm down, Mike," he said, though his voice held no hint of de-escalation. "Let's not ruin the fun just yet." The other bikers murmured amongst themselves, their earlier confidence tempered by Alex's sudden display of strength. Scarred Face turned back to Alex, his grin fading. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're in the wrong place to be playing the hero." The tension hung thick in the air, the bikers' bravado mingling with a newfound wariness. Alex stayed seated, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. He wasn't going to make the first move, but he wasn't going to back down either. Outside, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, the golden light streaming through the diner's windows, a stark contrast to the darkness brewing within. The tension in the diner was unbearable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Mike rubbed his wrist where Alex's grip had left a red mark, his face contorted with both pain and embarrassment. His pride couldn't take the humiliation in front of his gang, and his temper boiled over. "You think you're better than me?" Mike snarled, his voice trembling with anger. "I'll teach you some respect." Without warning, he lunged at Alex, swinging a fist aimed at his head. But Alex moved like a shadow, quick, precise, and unrelenting. He sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing Mike's arm mid-swing and twisting it sharply. Mike yelped in pain as Alex forced him down, his arm locked behind his back. "Stop," Alex said coldly, his voice low and commanding. "This ends now." But the humiliation of being subdued so easily only enraged Mike further. "Get off me, you son of a," he shouted, struggling futilely against Alex's iron grip. Before he could finish, Alex released him with a shove, sending him stumbling into a nearby table, which toppled over with a crash. The diner erupted into chaos. Scarred Face slammed his hands on the counter and barked, "Get him!" The bikers, momentarily stunned by Alex's speed, hesitated only briefly before springing into action. The wiry man with greasy hair was the first to charge, wielding a broken chair leg like a club. He swung it wildly, aiming for Alex's head. Alex ducked smoothly, stepping into the man's guard and delivering a precise elbow strike to his ribs. The man crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. Another biker, a burly man with tattoos snaking up his neck, rushed in from the side, trying to tackle Alex. But Alex was ready. He shifted his weight and redirected the man's momentum, flipping him over onto the floor with a loud thud. The biker groaned, clutching his back. Scarred Face watched the scene unfold, his grin replaced by a scowl. "Don't just stand there," he shouted to the others. "Take him down." Two more bikers joined the fray, one wielding a pool cue he had grabbed from a rack by the wall. He swung it at Alex, the wooden stick whistling through the air. Alex caught it mid-swing with one hand, twisting it out of the man's grasp before delivering a sharp jab to his shoulder, forcing him to drop to his knees in pain. The other biker, a stocky man with a shaved head, tried to grab Alex from behind. But Alex spun around, driving his knee into the man's stomach. The biker doubled over, groaning, and Alex shoved him aside, sending him sprawling onto the diner floor. The patrons who hadn't already fled now cowered in their booths, watching the scene in wide-eyed horror. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter, her hand gripping the phone but unable to dial. Mike had recovered enough to grab a knife from the table, his face twisted in a mix of rage and desperation. "You're dead, man," he yelled, rushing at Alex with the blade raised. Alex's eyes narrowed, his movements almost too fast to follow. He sidestepped the attack, catching Mike's wrist in one hand and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the floor as Mike cried out in pain. Alex kicked the weapon across the room, well out of reach, and pushed Mike backward into a booth, where he slumped, clutching his arm. "You don't know who you're messing with." Scarred Face growled, stepping forward at last. He pulled a chain from his belt, swinging it menacingly. "You're gonna regret ever stepping into my town." Alex stood his ground, his breathing steady despite the flurry of attacks he had just deflected. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," he said evenly. But if you keep pushing, you'll regret it. Scarred Face sneered. Big words for a guy who doesn't know when he's outnumbered. He swung the chain in a wide arc, aiming for Alex's head. Alex ducked low, the chain whipping past harmlessly. Before Scarred Face could recover, Alex stepped in, grabbing the chain and yanking it hard. Scarred Face stumbled forward, off balance, and Alex delivered a quick strike to his jaw. The leader of the bikers fell back, dazed, the chain slipping from his grasp. One by one, the remaining bikers hesitated, their earlier bravado now replaced by uncertainty. The man with the greasy hair tried to stand, but Alex shot him a warning look that froze him in place. "Enough," Alex said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. He stood in the center of the room, his stance steady and controlled, while the bikers groaned and nursed their injuries around him. "This isn't your diner. It's not your town. And you don't own me." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the bikers who hadn't joined the fight looked cowed, their swagger gone. Scarred Face glared up at Alex from the floor, clutching his jaw. "You're gonna pay for this," he hissed, but there was no strength behind the threat. Alex took a step closer, towering over him. "If you want to try again, you know where to find me," he said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, the eyes of everyone in the diner following him. As he pushed the door open, the waitress found her voice at last. "Wait," she called after him. "You can't just leave." Alex paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "They won't bother you again," he said simply, then stepped out into the fading light of the evening. The door swung shut behind him, leaving the bikers to nurse their wounded pride and the diner patrons to process the spectacle they had just witnessed. The quiet hum of the diner's fluorescent lights returned as Alex walked out into the fading sunlight. The door swung closed behind him, but the tension inside lingered, thick and suffocating. The bikers, now subdued and nursing their wounds, exchanged wary glances, their earlier bravado thoroughly crushed. Scarred Face sat slumped against the counter, cradling his swollen jaw, his chain lying abandoned on the floor. The waitress, still clutching the phone, finally set it down. Her eyes darted from the bikers to the door, then back again. "Who the hell was that guy?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Mike, still rubbing his wrist, muttered under his breath, "He's nobody. Just some drifter." But even he didn't sound convinced. The others remained silent, their usual snark and swagger replaced by an uneasy quiet. The patrons, too, sat frozen in their booths, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. A young couple whispered hurriedly to each other, while an older man in a cowboy hat nodded grimly, as though confirming something he already suspected. Outside, Alex stood by his motorcycle, brushing the dust from his jacket. He moved with deliberate precision, every motion controlled, his demeanor calm and unshaken. The adrenaline that had surged through him moments earlier was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he seemed as serene as if he had just taken a walk in the park. From inside, the waitress watched him through the window. Something about his stance, straight-backed, with an air of quiet authority, spoke of a discipline not found in ordinary men. Her gaze drifted to the patch on his jacket, partially obscured but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for, a faint trident insignia. Her breath caught in her throat. "You think he's military?" the old cowboy muttered, his gravelly voice cutting through the stillness. "Maybe," the waitress replied, her voice hushed. "He didn't fight like a regular guy. The way he moved." The cowboy nodded knowingly. "That's a trained man right there. Seen it before. Navy SEAL, most likely." The speculation rippled through the room like a whisper in a church. The bikers, still tending to their injuries, exchanged uneasy glances. Scarred Face's earlier threats now seemed hollow, his gang's tough guy image reduced to a pathetic charade. Mike, desperate to salvage his pride, spat on the floor. "Military or not, he's just one guy," he grumbled. "If he thinks he can just come into our town and—" "Shut up, Mike," snapped the wiry man with the greasy hair. He winced as he spoke, pressing a hand to his bruised ribs. "You got your ass handed to you just like the rest of us. Let it go." Scarred Face glared at the two of them but said nothing. His silence was louder than any words he could have mustered. The gang's leader, the man who had ruled with intimidation and brute force, now sat defeated, his authority shattered. Outside, Alex secured his pack to the back of his motorcycle. He didn't rush, didn't look back, and didn't acknowledge the stares from the window. He exuded an air of quiet confidence, as though the fight had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. As he climbed onto the bike, the waitress pushed through the diner's door, her apron fluttering in the evening breeze. "Hey," she called out, her voice tentative. Alex glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Yeah." She hesitated, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "Thanks for, stepping in." He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "You gonna be okay?" he asked, his tone as steady as ever. The waitress glanced back toward the diner, where the bikers still lingered, their wounded pride evident. "I think so," she said, though her voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. "But, who are you? Really?" For a moment, Alex considered her question. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and red. "Just a guy passing through," he said finally. The waitress frowned as though unsatisfied with his answer, but she didn't press further. "Well, you're a hell of a guy," she said softly. "Thanks again." Alex started the engine, its low rumble cutting through the quiet evening. He gave her one last nod before pulling onto the road, the wind catching the edges of his jacket as he rode away. Inside the diner, the silence was finally broken as Scarred Face pushed himself to his feet. He staggered slightly, leaning against the counter for support. "This ain't over," he growled, though his voice lacked conviction. "You hear me? It ain't over." The waitress turned, her eyes narrowing. "It is if you know what's good for you," she snapped. Her voice was stronger now, bolstered by the lingering presence of the man who had just walked out. "You and your buddies better clear out before the cops show up." The bikers exchanged uneasy looks. Mike muttered something under his breath, but none of them dared challenge her. One by one, they shuffled out of the diner, their movements slow and defeated. Scarred Face lingered a moment longer, shooting a venomous glare at the patrons who had watched his humiliation. As the last of them disappeared into the night, the waitress let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "I guess that's one way to end a shift." The patrons murmured their agreement, their fear gradually giving way to awe. The old cowboy tipped his hat to her as he stood to leave. "You see a man like that, you remember him," he said gruffly. "Ain't every day you meet someone who's seen the kind of things he has and still walks away calm." The waitress nodded absently, her thoughts still on the mysterious stranger. She didn't know where he had come from or where he was going, but one thing was clear: Alex wasn't just a drifter. He was something more, something the likes of Scarred Face and his gang would never understand. As the rumble of Alex's motorcycle faded into the distance, the diner's patrons slowly came back to life, their murmurs growing louder as they replayed the scene in their minds. Plates of uneaten food sat cold on tables, coffee cups untouched, as the small crowd processed what they had just witnessed. The tension had been so thick it left an imprint on everyone present. Scarred Face sat slumped in a booth, his bruised jaw set in a grimace, while his gang members nursed their own injuries. Joel, a younger biker with a clean-shaven face and a tribal tattoo snaking up his arm, avoided looking at the others. He had stayed out of the fight entirely, too intimidated by Alex's precise and lethal movements. Now, he felt an overwhelming sense of shame for his cowardice, but also a simmering resentment. "Man didn't even break a sweat," one of the patrons whispered, his voice laced with awe. "Did you see how he took them down? Like he's done it 100 times before." "Who is he?" another asked. "A SEAL maybe? Special Forces?" The waitress, now slightly steadier on her feet, stepped behind the counter and grabbed a rag to wipe down the mess left by the fight. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice carried strength. "Doesn't matter who he was," she said. "What matters is he stood up when none of us could." Joel's head snapped up at her words. The humiliation stung like salt in an open wound. "We didn't need saving," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for only the nearby bikers to hear. Scarred Face glared at him. "Shut up, Joel," he growled. His voice was hoarse, and his pride was battered even more than his jaw. "You didn't do a damn thing back there. Least you could do is keep your mouth shut?" Joel bristled but said nothing. The truth of Scarred Face's words hung heavy in the air. The gang had been utterly humiliated, their tough guy image shattered by a single man who hadn't even seemed to break a sweat. But the story of what happened wasn't confined to the diner's walls for long. By the time the bikers stumbled out and revved up their motorcycles, still licking their wounds, whispers of the fight were already spreading. One patron made a call to his brother, another sent a text to a friend, and within hours, the tale had reached the far corners of the small Route 66 town. The bikers rode out in a loose formation, their silence louder than any argument could have been. Even Joel, usually full of swagger, felt the weight of their collective disgrace. As they reached the outskirts of town, he finally broke the silence. "What now? We just let some drifter make fools of us?" Scarred Face didn't answer right away. He stared straight ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the handlebars of his bike. "We regroup," he said finally, his voice low. "Nobody humiliates us and gets away with it." Joel, emboldened by the leader's response, pressed further. "You think he'll come back through? Or do we go after him?" "We wait," Scarred Face snapped, cutting him off. "Let him think he's safe. But when we find him—" He left the sentence unfinished, his meaning clear. Back in town, the story had taken on a life of its own. The tale grew with each retelling, details exaggerated for effect. Some said Alex had fought off a dozen bikers single-handedly. Others claimed he had moved so fast they could barely see him, disarming and incapacitating his attackers in mere seconds. A few even speculated that he might have been some kind of government operative, hiding out in plain sight. The waitress found herself at the center of the buzz. People came into the diner just to hear her recount the events, their eyes wide with disbelief as she described Alex's calm demeanor and his effortless takedown of the gang. "Did he say anything about himself?" one man asked as he sipped his coffee. "Not much," she admitted. "Just that he was passing through. But I'll tell you this, he wasn't just some drifter. The way he moved, the way he handled himself, you don't learn that on the streets." The old cowboy from earlier chimed in. "I've seen men like him before. Back in the day, we called 'em ghosts. They could walk into a war zone, handle the worst of it, and come out looking like they just stepped out of a Sunday service." "Do you think he'll come back?" the waitress asked quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "If he's smart, he'll keep moving," the cowboy said. "Men like that don't stick around where they've made enemies." But for all the admiration Alex earned from the townsfolk, the bikers were determined to reclaim their reputation. Joel, in particular, couldn't shake the bitterness that gnawed at him. Everywhere he went, people stared, their knowing smirks a constant reminder of his gang's humiliation. His frustration boiled over one night as he paced the small clubhouse they used as a base. "We gotta do something," he said, slamming his fist on the table. "We can't just sit here and let everyone laugh at us." Scarred Face shot him a warning look. "You think I don't know that? You think I like being the punchline of this town? Then let's find him." Joel insisted. "Take him down. Show everyone we're not to be messed with." Scarred Face stood slowly, his imposing figure casting a long shadow in the dim light. "You think it's that simple? That guy wasn't some random punk. He was trained. You saw how he moved. If we go after him, we better be damn sure we finish the job." Joel nodded, though the weight of Scarred Face's words sobered him. For now, they could only wait and watch, their bruised egos fueling their need for revenge. Meanwhile, Alex continued down Route 66, the hum of his motorcycle the only sound in the vast expanse of desert. He didn't look back. The fight at the diner was just another stop on a journey he hadn't yet defined, a fleeting moment in a life he kept deliberately shrouded in mystery. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Alex knew one thing for certain. His past might not define him, but it would always follow him, just as the whispers of his actions now echoed in the town he had left behind. The sun had fully set as Alex's motorcycle roared down the long stretch of Route 66, the endless road lit only by the faint glow of his headlight and the pale shimmer of a crescent moon. Behind him, the small town was already fading into memory, but its people, and the lessons of the encounter, would linger far longer than he intended. In the diner, the aftermath of Alex's quiet dominance had begun to take shape. Scarred Face, still nursing his swollen jaw, barked at Joel and the others to clean up the mess, but the tone of his voice lacked its usual menace. He was angry not just at Alex, but at himself for being so thoroughly beaten. Every grunt and groan from his men as they picked up toppled chairs and wiped down spilled coffee was a reminder of their humiliation. Joel, his youthful bravado dented but not broken, slammed a chair upright with unnecessary force. "We could have taken him," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "If we'd all gone in at once." "You really believe that?" the wiry man with greasy hair said, wincing as he sat down. "Did you even see how he moved? Guy wasn't fighting us. He was handling us, like he'd done it 100 times before." Scarred Face shot them a glare. "Shut your mouths. He's gone, and we'll deal with him if he comes back." But even as he spoke, the doubt in his voice was clear. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but they all knew Alex was in a league far beyond theirs. He wasn't just strong, he was disciplined, controlled. He had left them bruised and battered, but more than that, he had exposed them for what they were, bullies who relied on numbers and noise rather than skill or strength. Outside the diner, the waitress stood in the cool night air, staring down the empty road where Alex had disappeared. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving her with a strange mixture of relief and awe. She replayed the events in her mind, marveling not at the fight itself, but at Alex's composure throughout it all. "True strength," the old cowboy had said before leaving, tipping his hat as he paid for his coffee. "That's what we saw tonight. Not just fists, but restraint. That's what makes a man." She didn't know much about Alex, none of them did, but she could see the truth in those words. He hadn't thrown a single punch until he was attacked, and even then his strikes were measured, precise, never more than what was necessary. He hadn't stayed to gloat or revel in his victory. He had simply walked away. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with the story. It was retold in bars, at gas stations, and around kitchen tables. Some embellished the tale, claiming Alex had taken on the bikers blindfolded, or that he had disarmed Scarred Face with nothing but a glare. But the core of the story remained the same. A lone drifter had rolled into town, taught a gang of bullies a lesson they wouldn't forget, and left without saying much at all. As for Alex, he rode on, the rhythmic hum of his motorcycle a constant companion. He wasn't thinking about the fight. He wasn't the type to dwell on things he couldn't change. The encounter at the diner was just another instance of the philosophy he had carried with him for years. True strength wasn't about dominating others, but about mastering oneself. It was a lesson he had learned the hard way, through years of rigorous training and experiences that had left deeper scars than any barroom brawl ever could. Whether it had been his time in the military, where discipline and control were the difference between life and death, or the life he had built afterward, Alex had come to understand that anger and aggression were weaknesses, not strengths. As he stopped at a gas station hours later, the attendant, an older man with thick glasses and a weathered face, looked up from his newspaper. "Evening," the man greeted. "Heading far?" Alex nodded as he filled up his tank. "Far enough." The man chuckled. "Ain't heard you're kind of quiet in a while. Most folks come through here talking big, bragging about this or that." Alex offered a small smile. "Talking doesn't get much done." The attendant chuckled again, shaking his head. "Ain't that the truth?" After paying, Alex hit the road again, his thoughts turning to the people he had left behind. He knew the bikers would lick their wounds and likely stew in their humiliation for a while. Maybe they'd come looking for him, but he doubted it. Men like Scarred Face relied on fear, and he had taken that away from them. Without it, they were just loud and desperate. As for the waitress and the others in the diner, he hoped they'd taken something from the encounter. Not just the excitement of a good story, but a sense of what strength really looked like. He hadn't fought to humiliate anyone or prove a point. He had fought to end the threat they posed to others. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the landscape in soft hues of pink and gold, Alex had left the memory of the fight far behind. He didn't need to look back. The lessons he left behind would ripple through the town long after his departure, carried in the stories they told and the respect they now understood. Strength wasn't about being the loudest or the toughest. It was about knowing when to act and when to walk away. Alex was a man who lived by that creed, a man who understood that true power came from control, calmness, and respect, for oneself and for others. He didn't need to say it. His actions had spoken loud enough.